The carriage stopped hard outside the gates of Ashford Manor, and Alina Whitfield stepped down before the wheels had even settled. Her hands were shaking. She had just heard the news from her sister Grace, and she could not believe it was true. Richard, her husband of 6 years, had given away her mother's ring, the one he had promised to keep locked in the family safe, to a woman named Camille Duval. Alina walked through the front doors without waiting for the butler to open them. The house was quiet, too quiet for a home that once felt warm and full of life. She found Richard in his study, standing by the window with a glass of brandy in his hand. He did not turn around when she entered. "Is it true?" Alina asked, her voice steady even though her heart was pounding. "Did you give my mother's ring to that woman?" Richard finally turned. His face showed no shame, only tiredness, as if he had expected this conversation and wished it would simply pass. "Camille needed something nice for the dinner tonight," he said. "It was just sitting in the safe. I did not think you would mind." Alina felt the room tilt slightly. She had grown used to small insults over the past year, but this one cut deeper than any before it. That ring had belonged to her mother, and to her grandmother before that. It was the only piece of her old life she had brought into this marriage, a marriage her family had arranged when she was only 20, when Richard's wealth and land had seemed like a solution to her family's troubles. "You did not think I would mind," Alina repeated slowly. "Richard, that ring is the only thing I have left of my mother. She died wearing it on her hand until the very end, and you gave it to your mistress." The word hung in the air between them. Richard did not deny it. He simply looked away, back out the window, as though the matter did not deserve further discussion. Alina had known about Camille for months. Everyone on the estate knew. The maids whispered about it in the kitchen, the stable boys joked about it when they thought no one could hear, and even the old gardener, a kind man named Harold who had worked for Richard's father before him, had given Alina a look of pity more than once. But knowing something, and having it confirmed with such carelessness, were two very different pains. She thought back to how it had all started. 2 years into their marriage, Richard had hired Camille to help manage the estate's growing business accounts. She was clever, quick with numbers, and had a way of making Richard laugh that Alina had almost forgotten he was capable of. At first, Alina welcomed the help. The estate was large, with farmland stretching for miles, tenant families to look after, and a business in wool and grain that required careful attention. Alina herself had tried to help with the books in the early years, but Richard had gently pushed her toward other duties, saying numbers were not a woman's concern in his family, though his own mother had kept the books for 30 years before him. Camille arrived like a breath of fresh air into a house that had grown stale with routine. She was younger than Alina by only a few years, but she carried herself with a confidence that Alina had never possessed. She laughed loudly at dinner parties, she rode horses without fear, and she never seemed to worry about what others thought of her. Richard was drawn to her the way a man who has spent his whole life following rules is drawn to someone who breaks them freely. Alina tried to compete at first. She wore brighter dresses. She learned to ride better. She asked Richard questions about the estate business, hoping to show him she could be interesting too. But every effort seemed to fall flat, swallowed by his growing distraction. He began staying late in his study with Camille, going over papers that took hours longer than they should have. He began missing dinners, sending word through the staff that he was busy, while Alina sat alone at the long dining table, staring at the empty chair across from her. The staff noticed everything, of course. Nothing stayed hidden for long in a house full of people whose job was to watch and serve. Margaret, the head housekeeper, had worked for the family for over 20 years and had seen many changes in the household, but never one quite like this. She often found Alina sitting quietly in the garden in the early mornings, before the rest of the house woke, staring at nothing in particular. "You deserve better than this, ma'am," Margaret told her once, setting down a cup of tea beside her without being asked. "Forgive me for saying so, but a blind man could see how that woman looks at your husband and how he looks back." Alina had thanked her for the tea but said nothing else. She was not ready, then, to admit out loud what she already knew in her heart. The turning point in Alina's memory came slowly, not all at once. It was not one single moment but a collection of small wounds that built up over time, like water dripping onto stone until the stone finally cracks. There was the time Richard forgot her birthday because he was traveling to town with Camille to review a new business deal. There was the time he brought Camille to a neighbor's wedding instead of Alina, claiming it was simply easier since Camille understood the business partners better. There was the growing habit of Richard discussing estate matters with Camille first, only informing Alina of decisions after they had already been made. Alina's own family noticed the change in her too. Her sister Grace visited every few months, and each time she found Alina a little quieter, a little thinner, a little more withdrawn into herself. Grace had never liked Richard much, even before the marriage, and she often urged Alina to speak up, to demand respect, to leave if she had to. But Alina had been raised to believe that a marriage, once made, was meant to be endured, not escaped. Her own mother had stayed with a difficult husband for 30 years, and Alina had absorbed that lesson deep into her bones, even as it slowly wore her down. Standing now in Richard's study, holding the weight of this newest betrayal, Alina felt something shift inside her that had never shifted before. It was not anger exactly, though anger was certainly there. It was something closer to clarity, as if a fog she had been living in for years had suddenly lifted, showing her the shape of her life without any softening or excuse. "I want the ring back," she said quietly. Richard sighed, the sound of a man being asked to do something tedious. "I will speak to Camille about it," he said. "I am sure she will understand it was a misunderstanding." "No," Alina said, her voice firmer now. "I do not want you to speak to her. I want you to take it back tonight before the dinner and return it to me. It belongs to my family, not to yours, and certainly not to her." Richard looked at her properly for the first time since she had entered the room, as though surprised to hear such firmness in her voice. For 6 years, Alina had rarely raised her voice to him, rarely pushed back against his decisions, no matter how much they hurt her. He was used to a quiet wife who accepted whatever arrangement he offered. "You are making too much of this," he said finally. "It is just a piece of jewelry." "It is not just a piece of jewelry to me," Alina replied. "But I understand now that it never mattered to you, and neither, it seems, do I." She turned and left the study before he could respond, walking quickly down the long hallway toward her own room, past portraits of Richard's ancestors staring down at her from gilded frames, past the grandfather clock that had ticked away the hours of her marriage with steady, indifferent patience. She reached her bedroom, closed the door, and sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands finally trembling with the full weight of what had just happened. Outside her window, she could see the estate grounds stretching out toward the horizon, green fields dotted with grazing sheep, the distant line of trees marking the edge of Richard's land. It was a beautiful view, one she had admired countless times over the years. But tonight it looked different to her. It looked like a cage, however golden, however comfortable, still a cage all the same. Alina did not go down for dinner that evening. She heard the carriages arrive outside, heard the laughter and conversation drifting up from the dining room below, heard, at one point, a voice she recognized as Camille's, bright and confident, filling the space that should have belonged to the lady of the house. She sat by her window long into the night, watching the candlelight flicker in the windows below, and for the first time in a long while she allowed herself to imagine a different kind of life. A quieter one perhaps, a smaller one, but one where she was not waiting, always waiting, for a man to remember she existed. She thought of her mother's ring, sitting now on another woman's finger downstairs, and she made a quiet promise to herself. Whatever happened next, she would not spend the rest of her years shrinking herself to fit into a marriage that had no room left for her. The dinner ended sometime after midnight. She heard the carriages leave, heard Richard's footsteps pass her door without stopping, heard the house finally settle into silence. And in that silence, Alina Whitfield began, for the first time, to think seriously about what it might mean to leave. Morning came, and with it, a strange calm settled over Alina. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple gray dress instead of the bright colors she used to wear when she was still trying to catch Richard's attention. She no longer felt the need to compete for something that was not truly hers to win. She went down to the dining room expecting to find it empty, but Richard was already there, sitting at the head of the table with a newspaper in his hands. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment, something like guilt flickered across his face before it disappeared behind his usual composed expression. "You did not come down last night," he said. "I did not feel like watching you entertain your guest," Alina replied, taking her seat across from him. A servant poured her tea, and she waited until the young woman had left the room before speaking again. "Did you get the ring back?" Richard set down his newspaper with a small, irritated sigh. "I spoke to her this morning. She will return it later today." "Good," Alina said simply, and returned her attention to her tea, refusing to let him see how much the conversation had cost her to have so calmly. Over the following weeks, Alina began to notice things she had perhaps chosen not to see before. She noticed how Richard's schedule had quietly rearranged itself around Camille's presence, how business meetings that once took an hour now stretched into entire afternoons, how Richard had started taking his morning rides not alone, as he once did to clear his head, but with Camille at his side, laughing at something Alina was never told. Grace came to visit again in early spring, and this time, Alina found herself telling her sister everything, holding nothing back. They sat together in the small sitting room that had once been Alina's favorite place in the house, a room with tall windows that let in soft afternoon light, filled with books she rarely had time to read anymore. "You need to leave him," Grace said bluntly, not for the first time. "Alina, this is not a marriage. This is you living in his house, while he builds a life with someone else." "It is not that simple," Alina said, though even as she spoke the words, she felt less certain of them than she once had. "I have no money of my own, no property. If I leave with nothing." "You have your dignity," Grace said, "which is worth more than his money, though I understand that is easy for me to say when I am not the one who has to live it." Alina appreciated her sister's honesty, even when it stung. Grace had married a modest but kind schoolteacher, a man who adored her and never once made her feel invisible in her own home. Alina sometimes envied that simplicity, that quiet devotion, even though Grace's life had far less wealth and comfort than her own. The situation with Camille grew bolder as the months passed. What had once been carefully hidden behind polite excuses became something closer to open display. Richard began inviting Camille to social events that had always been reserved for Alina as his wife. At the county fair in early summer, Alina arrived on Richard's arm as expected, only to find that Camille had been seated at their table for the evening's dinner, introduced by Richard to their neighbors as his business partner and dear friend, a phrase that fooled absolutely no one. Alina sat through that dinner with her back straight and her expression pleasant, though inside she felt something curling tight in her chest, a mixture of humiliation and something colder, something that felt almost like resolve hardening into shape. She watched the way their neighbors' eyes moved between her and Camille, the way conversations grew slightly awkward whenever Richard leaned too close to laugh at something Camille said, the way Mrs. Pemberton, an old family friend, gave Alina a look of quiet sympathy across the table. After the dinner, as their carriage rolled back toward the estate under a dark summer sky, Alina finally broke the silence between them. "Everyone at that table knew," she said. "Every single person there knew what she is to you, and you still brought her, and you still introduced her as though the rest of us were fools." Richard did not answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the guilt she had hoped to hear, only a kind of weary defensiveness. "I do not see why it matters so much to you. You know my feelings for you have not changed." "Your feelings for me are not the problem, Richard," Alina said, turning to look at him directly, something she rarely did during their arguments. "The problem is what you are willing to do in front of other people. The problem is that you have made me into the woman everyone pities, while she becomes the woman everyone envies." Richard had no response to that, and the rest of the ride home passed in heavy silence. It was around this time that Alina began, quietly and carefully, to prepare herself for a future she had not yet fully decided to pursue, but could no longer ignore as a possibility. She started small. She asked Harold, the old gardener, to teach her about the small vegetable garden behind the servants' quarters, learning skills she had never needed to learn as the lady of a great estate. She began reading books on household management and simple trades, subjects far removed from the poetry and music she had been taught as a young woman preparing for a comfortable marriage. She began, without telling anyone, saving small amounts of the household allowance Richard gave her each month, setting aside coins in a hidden box beneath the floorboard of her wardrobe. She did not know, then, exactly what she was preparing for. Perhaps she hoped Richard would change, would wake up one morning and remember the woman he had married, would end things with Camille and return to the life they once, however imperfectly, shared. But some quiet part of her, growing stronger with each small insult, understood that this hope was fading, and that she needed to be ready for whatever came next. Camille, for her part, seemed to sense the shifting tide of power within the household, and she grew bolder with each passing week. She began giving instructions to the household staff directly, bypassing Alina entirely, as though she were already the mistress of the house in more than just name. Margaret came to Alina one afternoon, clearly upset, describing how Camille had told the kitchen staff to prepare a particular dinner menu for that evening, one that Alina had not been consulted about at all. "I told her that decisions about the household belong to you, ma'am," Margaret said, her voice tight with anger on Alina's behalf. She simply smiled and said Richard had asked her to handle it since you seemed tired lately. Alina felt her hands curl into fists at her sides, though her face remained calm. "Thank you for telling me, Margaret. Please continue to bring such matters to me directly." That evening, Alina confronted Richard about it, her patience finally beginning to fray at the edges. "She is giving orders to my staff now," Alina said. "In my own home." "Our home," Richard corrected, almost absently, as though the distinction mattered more to him than the actual complaint. "And she was only trying to help. You have seemed distant lately, Alina. Perhaps if you were more involved in things, she would not need to step in." The unfairness of this statement struck Alina so forcefully that for a moment she could not speak. She had been distant, yes, but only because every attempt she made to be involved, to be present, to be a true partner in their marriage and their estate, had been quietly pushed aside in favor of someone else. To have that distance, created entirely by his own choices, thrown back at her as though it were her failing, felt like a wound layered on top of older wounds that had never properly healed. "I have not been distant, Richard," she said quietly. "I have been pushed out. There is a difference, though I do not expect you to see it." She left the room before he could reply, retreating to the small sitting room where she had spoken with Grace weeks before, and she sat alone in the fading evening light, staring out at the gardens below, thinking about the woman she had been when she first arrived at this estate as a young bride, full of hope despite the arranged nature of her marriage, and the woman she had become since, worn thin by years of quiet dismissal. Late that night, unable to sleep, Alina rose from her bed and walked down to the study, drawn by some instinct she could not quite name. The room was empty. The fire in the hearth burned low, and moonlight spilled across Richard's desk, illuminating stacks of papers he had left scattered there. She had never gone through his private papers before, had always respected the boundary of his work even as he crossed so many boundaries of his own, but something in her that night felt different, braver, more willing to see clearly what she had spent so long trying not to see. Among the papers, she found letters, business correspondence mostly, but tucked among them were several notes in a handwriting she recognized as Camille's, informal in tone, affectionate in a way that left no room for doubt about the nature of their relationship. Alina read only a few lines before setting them back down exactly as she had found them, her hands steady despite the storm building inside her chest. She did not confront Richard that night. Instead, she returned to her room, lay awake until the sky outside began to lighten with the first gray hints of dawn, and made a decision she had been circling for months without quite landing on. She would not spend another year of her life waiting for a change that was never going to come. She did not yet know how or when she would leave, but she knew, with a certainty that felt almost peaceful after so much uncertainty, that she would leave. The following morning, she wrote a letter to Grace, asking if she might come to stay with her for a short visit, a request she had never made before in 6 years of marriage. She sealed the letter carefully and gave it to one of the stable boys to post in town, watching him ride off down the long drive with something that felt, for the first time in a long while, like hope. Grace's reply came within the week, warm and immediate, insisting Alina visit as soon as she was able, and even offering to send her husband's carriage to collect her if that would make the journey easier. Alina read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the drawer of her writing desk, feeling for the first time in months that someone in her life was simply on her side without condition. She did not tell Richard about her plans right away. Instead, she waited for the right moment, watching the household rhythm shift around her as Camille's presence grew ever more permanent. It was during this waiting period that the true depth of Richard's favoritism revealed itself in ways Alina could no longer explain away or ignore. The first clear sign came during the planning of the annual harvest celebration, an event the estate had hosted every autumn for as long as Alina had been married into the family, and for generations before that under Richard's father and grandfather. It was traditionally the lady of the house who oversaw the preparations, choosing the menu, arranging the decorations, greeting the tenant families and neighboring landowners who attended each year. Alina had always taken great pride in this responsibility, one of the few areas where she felt she contributed something meaningful and lasting to the estate's community. This year, however, Richard informed her over breakfast, almost as an afterthought between sips of coffee, that Camille would be handling the arrangements instead. "She has a better sense of these things," Richard said, not looking up from his papers. "More modern ideas. I think the tenants will appreciate a fresh approach." Alina set down her fork carefully, forcing her voice to remain even. "I have organized this celebration for 6 years, Richard. The tenants know me. They trust me. What will they think when they see Camille standing in my place?" "They will think whatever they think," Richard said, finally looking up, his expression carrying a note of impatience, as though her objection was an inconvenience rather than a legitimate concern. "It is only one event, Alina. I do not understand why you are making it into something larger." But it was not only one event, and they both knew it, even if only one of them was willing to say so. It was the latest in a long line of small removals, each one chipping away at Alina's place within the household, within the marriage, within the community she had spent 6 years building relationships in. She thought of the tenant families she had come to know personally over the years, the children whose names she remembered, the elderly farmers she had brought baskets of food to during hard winters, the quiet friendships she had built through nothing more than consistent kindness and attention. To have all of that handed over to Camille, a woman who had been on the estate for barely 2 years and cared for none of these people the way Alina did, felt like watching a piece of herself being carved away and given to someone else entirely. She did not argue further that morning. She had learned over the past months that arguing rarely changed Richard's mind once he had settled on a decision, especially when that decision somehow benefited Camille. Instead, she simply nodded, finished her tea, and excused herself from the table, walking out to the garden where Harold was tending to the roses along the eastern wall. "You look troubled this morning, ma'am," Harold said, not looking up from his work, though his tone made clear he had noticed far more than he was letting on. "I am simply thinking, Harold," Alina said, settling onto the small stone bench near the rose bushes. "Thinking about a great many things." Harold nodded slowly, continuing his careful pruning. "My wife used to say that a person who is thinking that hard is usually preparing to make a change. I hope, if that is what you are preparing for, that it brings you some peace." Alina looked at him with surprise, unsure how much he truly understood of her situation, but grateful nonetheless for the quiet kindness in his words. "Thank you, Harold. I hope so too." The harvest celebration arrived a few weeks later, and Alina watched from the edges of her own estate as Camille moved through the crowd with practiced confidence, greeting tenant families with a warmth that felt, to Alina's eyes, entirely performed. though the tenants themselves seemed largely unaware of the tension simmering beneath the festive surface. Richard stood beside Camille for most of the evening, the two of them presiding over the celebration like a couple hosting their own guests, while Alina found herself pushed to the margins of an event she had once considered entirely her own. It was during this celebration that the final, unforgivable moment occurred, the one that would later mark, in Alina's memory, the true end of any hope she had been quietly holding onto. As the evening wound toward its close, Richard called for everyone's attention, raising his glass for what Alina assumed would be the traditional toast, thanking the tenant families for their hard work throughout the harvest season, a toast he gave every year, one that always included some small acknowledgement of Alina's role in organizing the event. This year, however, after thanking the tenants, Richard turned toward Camille, who stood beside him glowing with obvious pride, and continued speaking in a tone that carried clearly across the quieted crowd. "I also want to thank Camille," he said, "for bringing such wonderful new energy to this estate. Her contributions this year have made this celebration truly special, and I hope everyone here will join me in welcoming her more fully into our community in the seasons to come." The crowd offered polite applause, though Alina could see, even through the haze of her own shock and humiliation, the confused glances exchanged between several of the older tenant families, people who had known her for years and understood immediately what such a statement implied. Richard had not mentioned Alina at all, had not thanked her for the 6 years of celebrations she had organized before this one, had instead used this public moment, in front of everyone who mattered in their small community, to elevate Camille's position while erasing Alina's entirely. Alina stood frozen for a moment, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes shifting toward her, waiting to see how she would respond. She thought briefly of causing a scene, of speaking up in front of everyone and demanding Richard explain himself, of letting 6 years of quiet suffering finally boil over into public view. But something steadier within her, some deep well of dignity she had not known she still possessed after everything, held her back from that particular reaction. Instead, she simply smiled, a small, composed smile that revealed nothing of the storm inside her, excused herself quietly to the nearest cluster of guests, and made her way slowly toward the house, her steps unhurried despite every instinct urging her to run. She did not cry that night, though she had expected to. Instead, she sat by her window for hours, watching the last of the celebration lights flicker out across the lawn, watching the tenant families load into their carriages and wagons and make their way home, watching, finally, Richard and Camille walking together back toward the house long after the other guests had departed, their heads bent close together in easy, comfortable conversation. Margaret found her there sometime past midnight, bringing a cup of warm tea she had not asked for but was grateful to receive nonetheless. "I heard what happened at the celebration, ma'am," Margaret said quietly, setting the tea down beside her. "I am so sorry. It was not right what he did tonight." "No," Alina agreed softly, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "It was not right." "If I may say so, ma'am," Margaret continued carefully, clearly choosing her words with great caution, "I have worked in this house for over 20 years, and I have never seen a lady of this estate treated the way you have been treated this past year. You deserve so much better than this." Alina looked up at the older woman, feeling a wave of gratitude for her honesty, for the simple kindness of someone willing to acknowledge what Richard himself refused to see. "Thank you, Margaret. I think I am finally beginning to understand that myself." The following days passed in a strange, quiet tension. Richard did not apologize for his toast, did not seem to recognize that anything worth apologizing for had even occurred. He continued his routine as though nothing had changed, riding out each morning with Camille, retreating to his study each evening for long hours of business, while Alina moved through the house like a ghost, present but somehow increasingly invisible within her own home. It was during this period that Alina finally wrote back to Grace, confirming that she would come to visit within the month, though she did not yet mention the deeper decision forming steadily beneath that simple plan. She began, quietly and methodically, to prepare herself in earnest. She reviewed the small savings she had collected over the past months, modest but growing steadily. She began sorting through her personal belongings, separating what truly belonged to her, gifts from her own family, items she had brought into the marriage, from what belonged to the estate and would need to remain behind. She also began, carefully and without Richard's knowledge, seeking legal advice. A distant cousin of her mother's, a woman named Beatrice who had once faced a similarly difficult marriage decades earlier, put her in contact with a solicitor in a nearby town, a discreet and sympathetic man named Charles who specialized in matters of property and marriage law. Alina traveled to meet with him under the pretense of visiting a dressmaker, a small deception that left her feeling both nervous and strangely liberated. Charles listened carefully to her situation, asking thoughtful questions about the nature of her marriage contract, the property she had brought into the union, and the legal protections, however limited, available to a woman in her position. He explained, gently but honestly, that leaving would likely mean forfeiting most claims to the estate's wealth and property, given the customs and laws of the time, but that she was not without options, however modest they might be. "You have more strength than you perhaps realize, Mrs. Ashford," Charles told her, as she prepared to leave his office. "Many women in your position stay simply because they cannot imagine another way of living. The fact that you are here, asking these questions, tells me you have already imagined it, even if you have not yet found the courage to fully step into it." Alina carried those words with her on the quiet carriage ride back to the estate, turning them over in her mind again and again. She had imagined it, yes. But imagining a different life and actually stepping into it were two very different things. And she knew, with the harvest celebration still fresh and painful in her memory, that she was drawing steadily closer to the moment when imagination would need to become action. Alina's visit to her sister Grace arrived at last, and she found herself breathing more freely the moment the estate disappeared behind the bend in the road. Grace's home was modest compared to Ashford Manor, a comfortable but simple house on the edge of a small town, filled with the warm chaos of children's laughter and the smell of fresh bread from the kitchen. It was the kind of home Alina had almost forgotten existed, a home built on partnership rather than performance. Grace's husband, a schoolteacher named Edward, greeted Alina warmly at the door, treating her with a gentle respect that felt, after everything, almost startling in its simplicity. Over the following days, Alina watched the easy affection between her sister and brother-in-law, the way Edward asked Grace's opinion on household matters and genuinely listened to her answers, the way he came home each evening eager to spend time with his family rather than retreating into distant business affairs. It was not a life of great wealth, but it was, Alina realized with a quiet ache, a life of genuine partnership, something she had never truly experienced in her own marriage. "You seem lighter here," Grace observed one afternoon, as they sat together in the garden shelling peas for dinner, a task Alina found unexpectedly soothing after years of having such simple work done entirely by servants. "I feel lighter," Alina admitted. "I had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without waiting for someone's attention or bracing for the next disappointment." Grace set down her bowl and looked at her sister carefully. "Alina, I have to ask you plainly, what is your plan? You cannot keep living the way you have been living. It is destroying you slowly, and I do not think you even realize how much." Alina was quiet for a long moment, watching the afternoon light filter through the leaves above them. "I have been speaking with a solicitor," she said finally, "about my options, about what leaving would actually mean, legally and financially." Grace's eyes widened with surprise, quickly followed by something like relief. "And what did he tell you?" "That I would likely leave with very little," Alina said. "The estate, the property, most of it would remain with Richard, as is custom. I have some small savings of my own and my mother's jewelry, what remains of it after his generosity toward Camille. It would not be an easy life." "But it would be your own life," Grace said gently. "Free of him and free of her, and free of pretending to be something you are not simply to keep a roof over your head that never truly felt like home." Alina nodded slowly, feeling the truth of her sister's words settle into her chest with a strange mixture of fear and clarity. I know. I think I have known for some time now. I suppose I am simply gathering the courage to actually do it. During her 2 weeks with Grace, Alina found herself growing stronger in ways she had not expected. She helped in the kitchen, learning practical skills she had never needed as the wife of a wealthy landowner. She spent afternoons at the small local market with Grace, learning how ordinary women managed household budgets, negotiated prices, and built lives without servants or grand estates to support them. It was humbling in some ways, but also deeply empowering, a reminder that a life outside of Ashford Manor was not only possible, but might even hold its own quiet satisfactions. She received 2 letters from Richard during her stay, both brief and businesslike, asking when she intended to return and mentioning, almost in passing, that Camille had been helping to oversee some renovations to the west wing of the house in her absence. Alina read these letters with a strange detachment, as though they described the life of someone she used to be rather than the life she was currently living. She did not respond to either letter right away, savoring instead the rare freedom of not needing to immediately account for herself to her husband. When she finally did return to the estate, 2 weeks later than originally planned, she found the household in a state of quiet upheaval. The renovations Richard had mentioned had progressed further than she expected, and to her shock, several rooms in the west wing, rooms that had once served as a small private sitting area Alina used for reading and correspondence, had been entirely redecorated according to what Margaret quietly informed her were Camille's specific instructions. "She has been staying here more often, ma'am," Margaret told her, clearly uncomfortable delivering this news. "Not just visiting for business matters. Some nights she does not return to her own lodgings in town at all." Alina absorbed this information with a calm that surprised even herself. Perhaps it was the 2 weeks spent in Grace's home, surrounded by genuine warmth and honest partnership, that had finally burned away whatever illusions she had still been clinging to about the possibility of repairing her marriage. Perhaps it was simply that there was only so much a person could absorb before numbness became its own form of protection. She found Richard in his study that evening, and for the first time in their marriage, she did not knock before entering. "Camille has been staying here," she said, not as a question but as a statement of fact she needed him to confirm or deny. Richard did not look surprised by the confrontation, nor did he attempt to deny it. "The renovations required close supervision," he said. "It made sense for her to stay rather than travel back and forth each day." "In my house," Alina said quietly, "sleeping in rooms that were once mine while I was away visiting my sister." "Alina," Richard said, his voice carrying a note of weary frustration, as though he were the one being wronged in this conversation, "I do not understand why you continue to make everything into some grand betrayal. This is simply how things are between us now. I had hoped, by this point, you would have come to accept that." The casualness with which he spoke these words struck Alina more forcefully than any angry outburst could have. He was not ashamed. He was not even attempting to hide his relationship with Camille any longer. He was simply informing her, as one might inform a business partner of a routine change in arrangement, that his mistress now had a permanent place within the home Alina had once believed was theirs together. "I have accepted a great many things over the past 2 years, Richard," Alina said, her voice steady despite the storm building within her. "I accepted your late nights. I accepted your public favoritism. I accepted watching my mother's ring on another woman's hand. But I do not think I can accept this. I do not think I am willing to." Something flickered across Richard's face then, not quite concern, but perhaps the first genuine flash of uncertainty she had seen from him in months. "What exactly are you saying?" Alina had not planned to say what she said next, had not rehearsed the words or prepared herself fully for the moment, but they came anyway, rising up from some deep well of exhausted honesty that had finally overflowed its banks. "I am saying that I do not know how much longer I can continue living this way," she said. "I am saying that I have spent 2 years watching you build a life with another woman while I remain here, playing the role of your wife in name only. And I am saying that I am beginning to wonder whether that role is worth the price I am paying to keep it." Richard was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. "You would leave," he said finally, not quite a question. "Over this." "I would leave," Elena confirmed, "because I deserve a life where I am someone's priority, not their afterthought. I do not know if that life is possible for me right now. But I am beginning to understand that staying here, as things currently stand, is no longer possible either." She left the study without waiting for his response, walking back to her own room with a strange sense of having crossed some invisible threshold she could not uncross. She had said the words out loud now, had given voice to the thought that had been growing in her for months. There was no taking them back, and some part of her, exhausted as she was, felt a quiet relief in that finality. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere in the household shifted noticeably. Richard seemed, for the first time, genuinely unsettled by the possibility that Elena might actually follow through on her words. He made small efforts, clumsy and inconsistent, at reconciliation. He joined her for dinner more regularly, though the conversations remained stilted and awkward after so long apart. He asked about her time with Grace, though his questions felt performed rather than genuinely curious. He even, on one occasion, brought her a small gift, a book of poetry she had once mentioned enjoying years earlier, and gesture so unexpected that Elena found herself almost moved by it, before remembering how many similar small gestures had come to nothing in the past. But the fundamental problem remained unresolved, hovering over every interaction like a shadow neither of them fully acknowledged. Camille had not disappeared. Her presence on the estate continued, though perhaps with slightly more discretion than before, and Elena understood, with growing certainty, that Richard's small efforts at reconciliation were not truly about choosing her, but about avoiding the inconvenience and scandal of an actual separation. He wanted to keep both his comfortable arrangement and his dutiful wife, without giving up either one. It was during this uneasy period that Elena began, quietly and deliberately, to finalize her plans. She corresponded regularly with Charles, the solicitor, working through the practical details of what a separation would actually require. She continued saving what small funds she could, careful not to draw attention to her growing independence. She wrote frequently to Grace, who offered not only emotional support but practical advice about the realities of building a simpler life. And she waited, with a patience that had become almost a kind of armor, for the moment when Richard's true priorities would reveal themselves fully and completely, removing any lingering doubt about the path she needed to take. The moment Elena had been quietly bracing herself for arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, in the least dramatic circumstances imaginable, which somehow made it all the more devastating when it finally came. She had gone down to the study to retrieve a book she had left there the previous evening, expecting the room to be empty at that early hour. Instead, she found Richard and Camille together, standing close beside his desk, examining what appeared to be architectural drawings spread across the surface. Camille was pointing at something on the page, her hand resting lightly on Richard's arm in a gesture so casual, so comfortable, that it revealed more about the true nature of their relationship than any confession could have. But it was not the closeness itself that stopped Elena in the doorway. She had witnessed such closeness many times before, had trained herself to absorb such moments without outward reaction. It was the drawings themselves that caught her attention, architectural plans she recognized immediately as belonging to the East Cottage, a small but charming structure on the estate grounds that had once belonged to Richard's grandmother and had sat empty for years, used occasionally for storage but otherwise forgotten. "What is this?" Elena asked, stepping fully into the room. Richard looked up, and this time, unlike so many previous moments of discovery, he did not attempt to hide or minimize what she was seeing. "I am having the East Cottage renovated," he said, his tone carrying an unusual note of decision, almost defiance. "Camille will be moving in once the work is complete." The words landed with a strange, hollow finality. Not staying occasionally in the West Wing under the pretense of overseeing renovations, but moving in permanently, into a cottage on the very grounds of the estate Alina still, in name, called home. Richard was not merely continuing his affair discreetly, or even carelessly. He was formalizing it, building a permanent structure for Camille's presence in their shared life, as though Alina's feelings on the matter were no longer even a consideration worth acknowledging. "You are giving her a home," Alina said slowly, "on this estate, permanently." "It made sense," Richard said, and Camille, to her credit or perhaps simply her boldness, said nothing, allowing him to speak for both of them, though she did not step away from his side or remove her hand from his arm. "She spends so much time here already. It is more practical this way." Alina felt something inside her go very still, very quiet, in a way that felt almost peaceful compared to the turmoil of the previous months. She had spent so long absorbing small cruelties, waiting for some dramatic breaking point that never quite arrived, that this moment, delivered so plainly and without apparent shame, felt almost like a mercy. There was no more ambiguity left to cling to, no more room for hope that circumstances might shift, no more possibility of pretending this was anything other than exactly what it appeared to be. "I understand," Alina said quietly. Richard seemed almost surprised by the calm in her response, perhaps expecting the anger or tears that had marked so many of their previous confrontations. "Alina, I know this is difficult, but—" "No," Alina interrupted gently, holding up a hand. "I do not think you need to explain further. I understand perfectly now." She turned and left the study, walking not toward her bedroom this time, but toward the small sitting room where she had spent so many quiet hours over the past year, the room that had once been her retreat and had slowly become, in her mind, a kind of waiting room for whatever came next. She sat there for a long while, watching the morning light shift across the floor, feeling the strange calm settle more deeply into her bones. She did not cry. She had cried enough over the previous months, had spent countless nights alone with tears she never let Richard see. This felt different, this quiet, clear-eyed acceptance of a truth she had been circling for so long. There was nothing left to grieve that she had not already grieved in smaller pieces over the past 2 years. What remained now was simply the practical matter of what to do next. She spent the rest of that day in careful, deliberate preparation. She wrote a letter to Charles, confirming that she was ready to proceed with the legal separation they had discussed at length over the previous months. She wrote to Grace, informing her sister that she intended to leave the estate within the week and asking if the offer to stay with her remained open. She began, methodically and without haste, packing the belongings that truly belonged to her, setting aside anything that belonged to the estate or to Richard's family, taking only what she had brought into the marriage and the small amount she had accumulated since. Richard found her that evening in her room, surrounded by half-packed trunks, and for the first time since their confrontation that morning, something like genuine alarm crossed his features. "What is this?" he asked, gesturing at the trunks. "I am leaving, Richard," Alina said simply, continuing to fold a dress into the trunk before her without looking up. "I believe you already know that. I believe you have known for some time that this moment was coming." "You cannot simply leave," Richard said, his voice rising slightly, the first real crack of urgency Alina had heard from him in months. "We are married. This is your home." "This has not felt like my home for a very long time," Alina said, finally turning to face him. "You have made that abundantly clear in ways both small and large for the past 2 years. I am simply the last one to fully accept what everyone else in this household already understood." Richard ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration Alina recognized from years of watching him navigate business difficulties, though she had rarely seen him direct it toward her before. "This is not necessary, Alina. We can find some arrangement. Camille can stay in the cottage, and things between us can continue as they have been. Many marriages manage such arrangements." The suggestion, offered so plainly, as though it were a reasonable compromise rather than the very thing that had broken her heart over and over for 2 years, revealed to Alina, more clearly than anything before it, just how differently they understood the situation. Richard was not offering to choose her. He was offering to keep his current arrangement while simply asking her to continue tolerating it more openly, now with the added indignity of Camille living permanently on the grounds. "I do not want an arrangement, Richard," Elena said, her voice steady and clear. "I want a marriage. I want a husband who chooses me, who prioritizes me, who does not need to be caught in his own study before he tells me the truth about what is happening in our lives. You have had 2 years to choose that path, and you have chosen a different one, again and again, in ways too numerous to count. I am simply done waiting for you to change your mind." Richard was quiet for a long moment, and Elena watched something shift in his expression, a dawning recognition perhaps of just how serious her resolve truly was. "What will you do?" he asked finally, his voice quieter now. "Where will you go?" "I will stay with Grace for a time," Elena said. "And then I will build a life of my own, small as it may be compared to this one. I have made arrangements with a solicitor. The details will be handled properly, through proper channels, so there is no need for either of us to make this uglier than it needs to be." "And your mother's ring?" Richard asked suddenly, glancing toward her dresser, where the ring, returned to her months earlier after the initial incident, sat in its small box. Elena walked to the dresser, opened the box, and looked at the ring for a long moment, remembering her mother's hands, remembering the weight of family history it carried. She thought briefly of Richard's original gift to her, a wedding ring he had given her on their marriage day, still worn on her finger despite everything that had happened since. She removed that ring slowly, feeling its familiar weight leave her hand for the first time in 6 years. She walked back to where Richard stood, and held the ring out to him, not with anger, not with tears, but with a quiet, unshakable dignity that surprised even herself. "Keep your ring," she said simply. Richard stared at the ring in her outstretched hand, then at her face, clearly searching for some sign of hesitation, some hope that this gesture was merely dramatic rather than final. He found none. Elena's expression remained calm, resolute, entirely certain. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying something close to desperation now, an emotion she had rarely heard from him. "Please, do not do this." "I am not doing anything to you, Richard," Elena said gently, still holding the ring out between them. "I am simply refusing to continue pretending that I am your wife in anything more than name. You made your choice a long time ago. In 100 small moments, I chose not to see until I could no longer avoid seeing them. This ring represented a promise, and that promise was broken long before today. I will not carry the symbol of a promise that means nothing anymore." Richard finally took the ring from her hand, his fingers closing around it slowly, as though the weight of it had suddenly become far heavier than the small piece of gold it truly was. He said nothing further, simply stood there, staring down at the ring in his palm, while Elena returned to her packing, methodical and unhurried, as though the most difficult conversation of her life had not just concluded. He left the room eventually, without another word, and Elena continued packing late into the night, occasionally pausing to look around at the room that had been hers for 6 years, feeling a complicated mixture of grief and relief settling over her in equal measure. She grieved the marriage she had once hoped for, the partnership she had believed possible when she first arrived at Ashford Manor as a hopeful young bride. But she also felt, beneath that grief, a growing sense of lightness, as though she had finally set down a burden she had been carrying for far too long. She did not sleep much that night, her mind turning over the practical details of departure, the conversation with Charles she needed to finalize, the letter to Grace confirming her arrival, the arrangements for transporting her modest collection of belongings. But beneath the practical concerns, a quieter, steadier feeling had taken root, one she had not expected to find so soon after such a painful confrontation. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena Whitfield felt entirely, unmistakably like herself again, unburdened by the constant effort of trying to win back a place in her husband's heart that had, perhaps, never truly been hers to begin with. The morning Elena left Ashford Manor, the sky was clear and pale, the kind of quiet, unremarkable morning that seemed almost disrespectful given the weight of what was happening. She had expected somehow that leaving would feel like a storm, dramatic and loud, but instead it felt strangely ordinary, a series of small, practical steps that added up, piece by piece, to an enormous change. Margaret helped her load the last of her trunks into the modest carriage Charles had arranged, refusing to accept payment for her assistance despite Alina's insistence. "It has been an honor serving you these past years, ma'am," Margaret said, her eyes bright with tears she was clearly trying to hold back. "You deserve every good thing that is coming to you, wherever you go next." Harold appeared as well, offering a small cutting from the rose bushes he had tended for so many years, wrapped carefully in damp cloth. "For your new garden," he said simply, "wherever that may be." Alina embraced them both, feeling a wave of gratitude for the small kindnesses that had sustained her through the most difficult stretches of her marriage. The rest of the household staff gathered quietly near the entrance, offering their own quiet farewells, and Alina realized with some surprise just how many genuine connections she had built during her years at the estate, connections that had nothing to do with Richard or Camille or the tangled mess of their arrangement. Richard did not come down to see her off. She had not expected him to, not after their final conversation, but some small part of her had still held a faint hope that he might appear, might offer some final word of acknowledgement for the 6 years they had shared, however imperfect those years had been. He did not appear, and Alina climbed into the carriage without waiting any longer, understanding that his absence was, in its own way, a final and fitting confirmation of everything that had led her to this point. The journey to Grace's home took most of the day, and Alina spent much of it staring out the carriage window, watching the familiar landscape of Richard's estate give way gradually to unfamiliar roads and towns, each mile carrying her further from the life she had known and closer to whatever came next. She felt, throughout the journey, a strange combination of grief and anticipation, mourning the loss of security and status that came with leaving such a prominent marriage, while also feeling a growing curiosity about the woman she might become without Richard's shadow defining her days. Grace welcomed her with open arms, and the following weeks passed in a blur of practical adjustment. Alina helped around the house, learning skills she had never needed before, cooking simple meals, mending clothes, managing a household budget far smaller than anything she had overseen at Ashford Manor but requiring, she quickly discovered, just as much careful attention and skill. Charles finalized the legal details of the separation over the following months, and true to her earlier decision, Alina requested very little from Richard beyond what was legally hers to keep, refusing any additional support or property that might come with strings attached or ongoing obligation. She wanted a clean break, however financially modest it left her, rather than remaining tied to Richard through continued dependence. "You are entitled to more than this," Charles told her during one of their final meetings, reviewing the settlement papers spread across his desk. "The law would support a larger claim, given the circumstances of the separation." "I know," Alina said, "but I do not want anything from him beyond what allows me to build a simple, independent life. I do not want to spend the coming years entangled in disputes over money and property. I want to be free of him, completely and cleanly, even if that freedom comes with fewer comforts than I once enjoyed." Charles respected her decision, though Alina could see he did not entirely understand it. But for Alina, the choice felt essential to the new life she was building. She did not want to carry Richard's wealth into her future, tainted as it now felt by everything that had happened. She wanted to build something entirely her own, however small, however humble. With the small settlement she did receive, combined with her modest savings, Alina rented a small cottage on the outskirts of the town where Grace lived, close enough to visit her sister regularly, but far enough to establish her own independent household. The cottage was nothing like the grandeur of Ashford Manor, a simple 2-room structure with a small garden plot behind it, but Alina found herself, in those early weeks of settling in, feeling a contentment she had not experienced in years. She planted Harold's rose cutting in the small garden, watching over it carefully as it took root in its new soil, and found something quietly symbolic in watching it grow, a small piece of her old life finding new purpose in this different, simpler existence. She took in sewing work to supplement her modest income, a skill she had learned as a young girl before her marriage, but had rarely needed during her years as Richard's wife. Word of her careful, skilled needlework spread quickly through the small town, and within a few months, she had built a small but steady clientele, women from the town who appreciated both her craftsmanship and her quiet, dignified manner. Grace visited often, sometimes bringing her children, filling Alina's small cottage with laughter and noise that felt, after the cold silence of Ashford Manor's later years, like a genuine gift. Edward, Grace's husband, occasionally brought news from the surrounding area, including, on rare occasions, updates about Richard and the estate, though Alina found herself less interested in such news than she might have expected. "They say Camille has moved fully into the cottage now," Edward mentioned one evening, several months after Alina's departure, clearly uncertain whether such information would be welcome or painful. "And that Richard has been having difficulty managing the estate's business affairs, without proper oversight." Alina listened to this news with a curious detachment, as though hearing about the affairs of distant acquaintances rather than the marriage and home she had left behind. "I hope he finds a way to manage," she said simply, and meant it without bitterness, though also without any particular investment in the outcome. She had, in the months since leaving, found herself thinking less and less about Richard, about the marriage that had once consumed so much of her emotional energy, about the small daily hurts that had accumulated into the final breaking point. Instead, her thoughts turned increasingly toward her own small, developing life, the satisfaction of building something entirely her own, the quiet pleasure of a garden growing under her own care, the steady rhythm of honest work that provided for her needs without dependence on anyone else's goodwill. She made new friends in the town, women who knew nothing of her former life as the wife of a wealthy landowner, who knew her only as Alina, the skilled seamstress with the small cottage and the beautiful rose garden. This anonymity felt, in its own way, like another form of freedom, a chance to be known for who she was, and what she did rather than for her husband's wealth or status. There were difficult days, of course. Some evenings, sitting alone in her small cottage after a long day of work, Alina felt the weight of loneliness pressing in, missing the companionship of a partner, even one as flawed as Richard had ultimately proven to be. She missed, sometimes, the comfort and ease of Ashford Manor, the beautiful gardens, the grand rooms, the sense of security that came with such wealth, however illusory that security had ultimately proven when it came to matters of the heart. But these moments of doubt were increasingly outweighed by a growing sense of pride in what she was building, brick by brick, stitch by stitch, in this new life she had chosen for herself. She had left behind wealth and status, yes, but she had also left behind the constant anxiety of waiting for a husband's attention, the humiliation of watching another woman take her place in public and private, the slow erosion of self that had marked her final years at the estate. One evening, nearly a year after her departure, Alina sat in her small garden, watching the roses Harold had given her bloom for the first time in their new soil, deep red petals unfurling in the fading evening light. She thought back to the woman she had been standing in Richard's study, holding out her wedding ring, and felt a quiet, steady pride in the courage that moment had required, courage she had not fully recognized in herself until she saw how far it had carried her. She did not know, then, what the future held, whether she would remain alone or eventually find companionship with someone who valued her fully, whether her small business would continue to grow or remain modest, whether Richard would ever come to understand what he had lost in failing to choose her. But she knew, with a certainty that had grown steadily stronger with each passing month, that she had made the right choice in leaving, that whatever difficulties her new life presented, they were difficulties she faced as a whole, respected person, rather than as a wife slowly disappearing within her own marriage. Back at Ashford Manor, life without Alina had settled into a strange new rhythm, though not the smooth, uncomplicated arrangement Richard had perhaps imagined when he chose to formalize his relationship with Camille so openly. Camille had indeed moved into the East Cottage as planned, and within the household, her presence had shifted from that of an occasional visitor to something resembling though never quite matching the position Alina had once held. The staff, however, never fully accepted her in that role. Margaret remained coolly professional in her dealings with Camille, offering nothing beyond the basic courtesy required by her position, and the rest of the household staff followed her lead, treating Camille with a distant politeness that never warmed into the genuine respect and affection they had shown Alina over the years. Camille noticed this coolness, of course, and it grated on her, though she had little power to change it, unable as she was to command the same loyalty Alina had earned through years of genuine kindness and attention. Richard, for his part, found himself surprised by how much he missed the quiet competence Alina had brought to managing the household, a competence he had, in his years of distraction, come to take entirely for granted. Camille, though clever with numbers and business matters, showed little interest or skill in the domestic responsibilities that came with running such a large estate. Meals grew less carefully planned. Household expenses began creeping upward without proper oversight, and small maintenance issues that Alina had always caught and addressed quickly began to accumulate, unnoticed until they became larger, more costly problems. The first real crisis came about 8 months after Alina's departure, when a routine review of the estate's finances revealed troubling irregularities. Camille had been given increasing authority over the business accounts during her time managing them, and while she was skilled at identifying profitable opportunities, she had also, it emerged, made several risky investments without fully consulting Richard, investments that had not performed as she had promised. Richard confronted her about the losses, the first serious argument of their relationship, and found, to his growing alarm, that Camille's confident charm, so appealing during the early days of their affair, curdled quickly into defensiveness and blame when challenged. She insisted the losses were not her fault, that market conditions had shifted unpredictably, that Richard himself had approved the general direction of the investments, even if he had not reviewed every specific detail. "You never questioned my judgment before," Camille said sharply during one particularly heated exchange, a tone Richard had never heard her use before, one that reminded him uncomfortably of arguments he had once had with Alina, though lacking Alina's underlying dignity and restraint. "You trusted me completely. Why the sudden doubt now?" "Because we have lost a significant amount of money, Camille," Richard replied, his own patience fraying under the stress of the financial losses and the growing realization that his household, once so smoothly managed, had become increasingly chaotic since Alina's departure. "I need to understand how this happened." The argument marked a turning point in their relationship, the first crack in what had once seemed, at least on the surface, like an easy, uncomplicated partnership. Richard began, slowly and reluctantly, to notice other differences between Camille and Alina, differences he had perhaps willfully ignored during the excitement of their affair, but which became impossible to overlook once the daily realities of running a household and estate fell more heavily on his own shoulders. Alina had always managed the tenant relationships with genuine care, remembering names, illnesses, family celebrations, building a network of goodwill that had served the estate well during difficult harvests or unexpected hardships. Camille showed little interest in such relationships, viewing the tenants primarily as a business consideration rather than as people deserving of personal attention. Complaints began reaching Richard, quietly at first through Harold and other longtime staff, then more directly from tenant families themselves, expressing concern about the growing distance between the estate's management and the community it had always supported. Richard's own social standing began to suffer as well. The open nature of his relationship with Camille, tolerated with polite discretion while Alina remained his wife in name, became a subject of more direct scandal now that the marriage had formally ended, and Camille's position had shifted from mistress to something resembling a permanent partner without the legitimacy of marriage. Several longtime family friends, including Mrs. Pemberton, quietly distanced themselves from regular social engagement with Richard, a subtle but unmistakable signal of disapproval that stung more than Richard cared to admit. He found himself, on quiet evenings alone in his study, thinking more and more often about Alina, about the steady competence and quiet dignity she had brought to their marriage, qualities he had failed to properly value until their absence became so keenly felt. He thought about the small ways she had supported him over the years, the careful attention she had paid to details he had never noticed until they went unattended, the genuine warmth she had shown toward the people who depended on the estate for their livelihoods. He began making inquiries, discreetly at first, about Alina's life since leaving, learning through Edward, whom he encountered occasionally in town, that she had built a small but respectable life as a seamstress, that she seemed content, even happy in her simpler circumstances. This news brought Richard a complicated mixture of relief and regret, relief that she was managing well despite the modest circumstances of her departure, regret at the growing realization of just how thoroughly he had failed to appreciate what he once had. The situation with Camille continued to deteriorate over the following months. Without the shared secrecy and excitement of an affair to sustain their connection, and faced instead with the mundane, difficult realities of managing a large estate together, the two found themselves increasingly at odds. Camille grew frustrated with Richard's growing scrutiny of her business decisions, feeling that his trust in her had been irreparably damaged, while Richard grew increasingly aware of the ways their relationship had been built on excitement and novelty rather than the deeper partnership he had once shared, however imperfectly, with Alina. Their arguments grew more frequent, and Camille, sensing perhaps that her position on the estate was less secure than she had once believed, began pushing Richard toward decisions that would formalize her status more permanently, suggesting marriage once his separation from Alina was fully finalized, pressing him to transfer certain properties or business interests directly into her name as a show of commitment. Richard, still reeling from the financial losses her earlier decisions had caused and increasingly uncertain about the depth of his feelings for her, found himself hesitating in ways that further strained their relationship. It was during this period of growing tension that Richard's own son from an earlier connection, a young man named Oliver who had been raised primarily by his mother's family in a nearby county and rarely visited Ashford Manor, arrived unexpectedly for an extended stay, hoping to discuss his own future involvement in the estate's business affairs. Oliver, now a young man of considerable maturity and independence, had heard through family connections about the separation and the ongoing situation with Camille, and he did not hide his disapproval during his visit. "Father," Oliver said during one particularly frank conversation, "I do not understand how you allowed things to reach this point. Alina managed this estate and this family's reputation with such care for so many years. What has changed since her departure has not gone unnoticed, even by those of us who live at a distance." Richard found himself, for perhaps the first time, unable to offer a confident defense of his choices. He listened to his son's careful, respectful but pointed observations about the visible decline in the estate's community standing, the financial irregularities that had emerged under Camille's management, the general sense among longtime family friends and business associates that something essential had been lost since Alina's departure. The conversation with Oliver, combined with the mounting practical difficulties in his relationship with Camille, brought Richard to a period of genuine, uncomfortable self-reflection, the kind he had largely avoided during the earlier years of his affair, when the excitement of Camille's attention had made it easy to dismiss the growing costs of his choices. He began to understand, slowly and painfully, the full scope of what he had lost in failing to properly value Alina during their marriage, and the growing certainty that no amount of wishing could simply undo the consequences of those years of neglect and public humiliation he had inflicted upon her. Nearly 2 years after Alina had left Ashford Manor, Richard found himself standing outside a small cottage on the edge of a modest town, gathering the courage to knock on a door he had no real right to approach. His relationship with Camille had ended some months earlier, quietly, and without much drama compared to the dramatic beginning it had once had, both of them recognizing eventually that whatever had drawn them together had never been strong enough to sustain the weight of genuine partnership. Camille had moved on to manage business interests for another family in a neighboring county, and the East Cottage now sat empty once more, a quiet monument to a chapter of Richard's life he had come to view with considerable regret. He had spent the month since Camille's departure in careful, difficult reflection, working with Oliver, who had chosen to stay on and help manage the estate's business affairs, to rebuild the financial stability and community relationships that had suffered during the years of his distraction. The work had been slow and humbling, requiring him to personally repair relationships with tenant families he had neglected, to rebuild trust with business associates who had grown wary during the years of scandal and financial irregularity, to confront, in countless small ways, the true cost of the choices he had made. Throughout this period of rebuilding, thoughts of Alina had grown increasingly persistent, no longer the occasional regretful reflection they had once been, but a steady, constant presence in his mind. He found himself, during quiet evenings in the study where their final confrontation had taken place, remembering not the difficult final years of their marriage but the earlier ones. The genuine warmth she had brought into his life before his own choices had slowly eroded that warmth into something cold and distant. He learned, through careful and respectful inquiry rather than the more casual updates he had once received through Edward, that Alina's small business had grown considerably over the past 2 years, that she had become well known and well respected throughout the town for both her skilled needlework and her genuine kindness toward her neighbors, that she had built, from what by all accounts seemed like very little, a life of quiet dignity and independence that stood in stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded at Ashford Manor in her absence. It was Grace, somewhat reluctantly, who finally agreed to pass along Richard's request for a meeting, though she made clear, in the message she delivered to her sister, that Alina was under no obligation to agree, and that Grace herself remained deeply skeptical of Richard's intentions after everything her sister had endured. Alina received this news with a complicated mixture of emotions, surprise chief among them, followed by a careful, measured curiosity about what exactly Richard hoped to accomplish through such a meeting after 2 years of silence. She thought carefully before responding, drawing on the same quiet strength that had carried her through the difficult decision to leave in the first place, and eventually agreed to a brief meeting, though she made clear through Grace that she expected nothing in particular from the conversation, and would not be swayed by any attempt at grand gestures or dramatic apologies. And so Richard found himself, on a mild afternoon in early autumn, standing outside Alina's small cottage, taking in the modest but well-kept garden that surrounded it, noticing with a pang of recognition the deep red roses blooming near the entrance, roses he recognized, with some surprise, as descendants of the very bushes Harold had tended so carefully at Ashford Manor for so many years. Alina opened the door before he had a chance to knock, having watched his approach from her front window, and Richard was struck immediately by how different she looked, not older exactly, though 2 years had certainly passed, but somehow more settled, more entirely herself, in a way he found difficult to fully articulate even in his own thoughts. Gone was the careful, guarded composure she had worn like armor during their final years together. In its place was a quiet, easy confidence that seemed to come from somewhere deep and genuine, rather than from the effort of maintaining appearances. "Richard," she said, her tone polite but reserved, neither warm nor cold, simply neutral in a way that told him immediately she had no intention of making this conversation easy for him. "Please come in." She led him to a small sitting area near the front of the cottage, simple but comfortable, filled with evidence of her needlework scattered across various surfaces, half-finished projects that spoke to a life of steady, purposeful work. She offered him tea, which he accepted, and for a moment they sat in a silence that felt heavy with everything neither of them had yet said. "I imagine you are wondering why I asked to see you," Richard began finally, setting down his teacup carefully. "I am curious," Alina admitted, "though I confess I have some guesses." Richard took a deep breath, having rehearsed this conversation countless times over the previous weeks, though every carefully prepared word now felt inadequate in the face of actually sitting across from her again. I have spent the past 2 years, Alina, coming to understand the full weight of what I lost when I failed to properly value you during our marriage. Camille and I ended our relationship some months ago, and in the time since, I have done a great deal of difficult reflection about the choices that led to that relationship in the first place, and the pain those choices caused you. Alina listened quietly, her expression giving away little of her internal reaction, allowing him to continue without interruption. I know I cannot undo the past, Richard continued, and I do not come here today expecting you to simply forgive everything that happened, or to return to a life at Ashford Manor as though the past 2 years never occurred. But I wanted you to know that I understand now, more fully than I ever did during our marriage, how badly I failed you. And I wanted to ask, however unlikely it may be, whether there might be some possibility of rebuilding what we once had, of starting again with the understanding I have gained since losing you. The words hung in the air between them, and Alina sat with them for a long moment before responding, her expression thoughtful rather than emotional, considering his words with the same careful deliberation she had once brought to the decision to leave. "Richard," she said finally, her voice gentle but entirely certain, "I appreciate the honesty in what you have just said. I believe that your regret is genuine, and I am glad, for your own sake, that you have found some clarity about the choices that led to the end of our marriage. But I do not think returning to that life is something I want, or something that would be good for either of us." Richard's face fell slightly, though he had clearly prepared himself for the possibility of this response. "May I ask why? I understand if the trust has been broken beyond repair, but I had hoped—" "It is not only about trust," Alina interrupted gently, though not unkindly. "It is about the life I have built here, and the woman I have become in the process of building it. When I left Ashford Manor, I left behind not only a difficult marriage but a version of myself that had grown smaller and smaller over the years, constantly adjusting, constantly waiting, constantly hoping to become someone worth prioritizing. The woman sitting across from you now is not that woman. I built this life, this small business, these friendships, this garden, entirely on my own. And in doing so, I discovered a strength and independence I never knew I possessed during our marriage." She gestured around the small, comfortable room at the evidence of her work scattered throughout. "I am proud of what I have built here, Richard. It is modest compared to the life we shared, yes, but it is entirely mine, built through my own effort and skill, answerable to no one's expectations but my own. I do not think I am willing to give that up, even for the chance at a different, better version of what we once had." Richard absorbed her words in silence, and Alina could see, in the careful way he processed what she had said, that some part of him had perhaps expected this response, even while hoping for a different outcome. "I understand," he said finally, though his voice carried genuine disappointment. "I suppose I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that enough time and genuine change on my part might be enough." "I believe your change is genuine," Alina said, and meant it. "And I hope, sincerely, that you continue to grow from what you have learned these past 2 years. I hope you find, whether at Ashford Manor or elsewhere, the kind of partnership built on genuine respect and priority that I once hoped we might share. But I do not think that partnership can be built with me, not anymore. Too much has changed in both of us, I think, for that particular path to make sense." They spoke for a while longer, the conversation gradually shifting to more neutral territory, Richard asking about her business with genuine interest rather than performed politeness, Alina asking, out of simple human curiosity rather than any lingering emotional investment, about the current state of the estate and the tenant families she had once known so well. There was no bitterness in the conversation, no lingering resentment, simply the quiet, respectful closure of two people acknowledging a shared history that had reached its natural, final conclusion. When Richard finally rose to leave, he paused at the door, looking back at Alina with an expression that carried genuine warmth, however tinged with regret. "Thank you for seeing me, Alina, and thank you for being honest with me, even when I know that honesty was not easy to give. "Thank you for coming, Richard," Alina replied, walking him to the door. "I hope genuinely that you find happiness and peace, whatever path that takes you on." She watched him walk down the small path away from her cottage, past the roses that had grown so beautifully in their new soil, and felt, as he disappeared from view, a quiet, settled peace that told her, more clearly than any words could have, that she had made the right choice in refusing his offer of reconciliation. That evening, as she sat in her small garden watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, Grace arrived for one of her regular visits, curious to hear how the meeting with Richard had gone. "He wanted me to come back," Alina told her sister as they sat together among the roses, "to try again at the life we once had." "And what did you tell him?" Grace asked, though something in her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. "I told him that the woman he wanted back no longer exists," Alina said, smiling softly as she looked out over her small, carefully tended garden, the modest cottage that had become, over the past 2 years, a true and genuine home. "I told him I have built something new here, something entirely my own, and that I have no intention of giving it up, not even for the promise of a better version of what I once had." Grace reached over and squeezed her sister's hand, pride evident in her expression. "You have grown so much since you left that place, Alina. I hope you know how proud I am of you." "I am proud of myself too," Alina admitted, a realization that still felt somewhat new and unfamiliar, even after 2 years of building this quiet, independent life. "I spent so many years believing my worth depended on being chosen, on being someone's priority, on fitting into a life someone else had built for me. It took losing everything I thought mattered to finally understand that I could build something of my own, something that belonged entirely to me, needing no one else's validation to feel complete." As the sun set fully behind the horizon, casting the small garden into gentle evening shadow, Alina felt a deep, settled contentment that had nothing to do with wealth, status, or the approval of a husband who had once failed to see her true worth. She had left Ashford Manor with almost nothing, by the world's usual measures of success, but she had gained something far more valuable in the years since. A life built entirely on her own terms, a sense of self that no longer depended on anyone else's attention or affection, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that she had chosen herself, fully and completely, when it mattered most. Richard, meanwhile, returned to Ashford Manor that evening with a heavy heart, understanding now, more fully than ever before, that some choices could not simply be undone through regret and good intentions, no matter how genuine that regret might be. He had lost, through his own repeated failures to prioritize the person who had once loved him most faithfully, not only his marriage, but the chance at the kind of partnership he now understood he had never fully appreciated while he still had it. The estate remained his, the wealth and land and status all still intact, but he understood now, walking alone through the quiet halls that had once been filled with Alina's steady, gentle presence, that some losses could not be measured in property or money, and that the greatest wealth he had ever possessed had walked out his door 2 years earlier, asking nothing more than to be seen, valued, and chosen, and receiving, in return, only silence and neglect until it was far too late to matter. 3 years after leaving Ashford Manor, Alina Whitfield stood in the doorway of a shop she now owned outright, a small but well-established dress and tailoring business in the heart of the town she had come to think of as truly her own. What had begun as scattered sewing work taken in from her tiny cottage had grown, through years of careful effort and an ever-widening circle of satisfied customers, into a thriving establishment employing 2 young seamstresses she had personally trained, both of them local girls who had come to her with raw talent and little opportunity, much as Alina herself had once arrived in this town with almost nothing beyond her own skill and determination. The shop bore a modest sign above its door, simply reading Whitfields, a name Alina had chosen deliberately, reclaiming her family name rather than continuing to carry the Ashford name that had once defined her entire identity. It had felt, when she first commissioned the sign from a local craftsman, like the final piece of a long process of becoming fully herself again. A woman known not as someone's wife or someone's mistress's rival, but simply as Alina, a skilled businesswoman respected throughout the community for her work and her character in equal measure. Her days now followed a rhythm entirely of her own making. Mornings were spent in the shop, meeting with customers, reviewing orders, teaching her young apprentices the careful techniques she had spent years refining. Afternoons often found her walking through the town market, greeting neighbors by name, stopping to admire children who had grown considerably since she first arrived, feeling woven into the fabric of a community in a way she had never quite managed during her years at Ashford Manor, despite the grandeur of that former life. It was during one such afternoon market visit that she first properly met William Carow, a widowed farmer with two young children who had recently taken over management of a modest, but well-regarded orchard on the edge of town. Their initial meeting was entirely unremarkable, a simple exchange over the price of apples at his market stall, but something in his easy, genuine manner, the way he spoke to his children with patient warmth, the way he asked after her business with what seemed like real interest rather than polite formality, left an impression that lingered with Alina long after she returned home that evening. Their acquaintance grew slowly over the following months, built through small, unremarkable encounters at the market, occasional conversations after church services, a gradual friendship that neither rushed nor forced itself into something more significant than it naturally became. William, Alina learned, had lost his wife to illness some years earlier, and he carried his grief with a quiet dignity that reminded her, in some ways, of the strength she had needed to find within herself after leaving her own difficult marriage. Grace noticed the growing friendship long before Alina was willing to acknowledge it herself. "You light up when you speak of him," Grace observed one afternoon, as the two sisters sat together in Alina's small garden, now considerably more established than it had been in the early years of her independence. "He is simply a kind man," Alina said, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized the deeper truth her sister had already perceived. "A friend, nothing more." "For now, perhaps," Grace said, smiling knowingly, though she did not press the matter further, understanding better than most the caution Alina carried after everything she had endured in her first marriage. It took nearly a year for the friendship between Alina and William to grow into something more clearly defined, a slow, careful courtship built on genuine mutual respect, rather than the whirlwind excitement that had once characterized Richard's affair with Camille. William never made Alina feel as though she needed to compete for his attention, never left her waiting or wondering about her place in his priorities. He included her, gradually and naturally, in the daily life of his small family, and Alina found herself, to her own quiet surprise, falling in love again, though this love felt entirely different from anything she had experienced before, steadier, more equal, built on genuine partnership rather than the hope of eventually earning someone's full attention. They married quietly 2 years after their first meeting at the market stall, a small ceremony attended only by close family and friends, nothing like the grand affair that had marked her first marriage to Richard so many years earlier. Alina wore a simple dress of her own design, and William's 2 children, now old enough to understand and appreciate the joy their father had found again, stood proudly beside them throughout the ceremony. Alina did not give up her business upon marrying William, a point she had made clear from the earliest stages of their relationship, and one William had never once questioned or resisted. "Whitfield's belongs to you," he told her simply, when the topic arose during their engagement. "I would never ask you to give up something you built with your own hands, something that clearly brings you such genuine pride and purpose." This simple acceptance, so different from the years of subtle diminishment she had experienced during her first marriage, remained one of the qualities Alina treasured most about her new partnership. William never made her feel as though her ambitions or her independence were inconvenient obstacles to his own priorities. Instead, he celebrated her success, often visiting the shop simply to see her at work, bringing their children along to watch their stepmother's careful, skilled hands transformed simple fabric into beautiful, finished garments. News of Alina's remarriage eventually reached Ashford Manor, carried through the usual channels of town gossip and mutual acquaintances. Richard received the news with a complicated mixture of emotions, a lingering sadness at the final, complete closure it represented, mixed with a genuine, if bittersweet, happiness that Alina had found the kind of partnership and contentment that had eluded them during their own marriage. He had, in the years since their final meeting at her cottage, continued the slow work of rebuilding his own life, eventually finding, with Oliver's steady support, a measure of stability and purpose in properly managing the estate his family had held for generations, though he never again pursued a serious romantic relationship, understanding, perhaps, that he had not yet fully earned the kind of trust and partnership such a relationship required. Alina's business continued to flourish in the years that followed her second marriage, eventually expanding to include a small workshop where she trained young women from across the region in the skilled trade of fine tailoring and dressmaking, many of whom went on to establish their own successful businesses in neighboring towns. She became, in her own quiet way, something of a local legend, a woman whose story of rebuilding an independent life from very little inspired others, facing similarly difficult circumstances, to believe in the possibility of their own transformation. She spoke rarely of her years at Ashford Manor, not out of shame or lingering pain, but simply because that chapter of her life felt, with each passing year, increasingly distant from the woman she had become. When she did occasionally reflect on those difficult years, it was with a kind of gentle, distant compassion for the younger version of herself who had endured so much before finally finding the courage to choose a different path. On quiet evenings, sitting in the garden she had built with her own hands, surrounded now by William and their blended family of children, watching the deep red roses that had traveled with her from Ashford Manor's gardens bloom season after season in their new soil, Alina often reflected on the strange, winding path that had led her to this genuine contentment. She thought of the moment she had stood in Richard's study, holding out her wedding ring, uncertain of what the future held but certain, at least, that she could no longer continue as she had been. That single moment of courage, born from years of quiet suffering finally reaching its breaking point, had ultimately led her to this life, imperfect in its own small ways but built entirely on foundations of genuine respect, partnership, and self-worth that had been utterly absent from her first marriage. She had lost, in leaving Ashford Manor, the wealth and status that had once defined her existence. But in that loss, she had discovered something far more valuable: the unshakable knowledge that she was worthy of genuine love and priority, not because of what she brought to a marriage in terms of family connections or social standing, but simply because of who she was, a truth she had needed to learn to believe about herself before anyone else could ever properly show it to her. As the seasons continued to turn, marking the years of her new life with William and their family, Alina remained grateful, in a deep and abiding way, not for the pain of her first marriage, which she would not wish on anyone, but for the strength that pain had ultimately revealed within her, a strength that had carried her from a place of quiet suffering into a life of genuine, hard-won contentment, built entirely on her own terms, chosen freely, and treasured completely.